Hi everyone, welcome to our second lecture presentation on the topic of trait theories of personality. Note that this lecture introduces the next 3 weeks worth of material. This week, the emphasis is on learning the background and taking the IPIP-NEO, which you should be doing before this video. Next week, you will focus on some of the other popular trait theory tests, such as the HEXACO and DISC. In the following week, you'll dive into the world of Sam Gosling's Snoop to learn more about how to find evidence of the Big Five in private spaces. You should already be making your way through his book and might be making some connections already. This lecture is designed to give you all of the background knowledge needed to begin familiarizing yourself with the information prior to engaging with the supplemental materials and assessments over the next few weeks. The only thing you need to do this week prior to viewing the video is take the IPIP-NEO. If you haven't taken it already, please do so before proceeding with the lecture video. Traits describe individual differences in terms of characteristic thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They can be thought of as broad, stable patterns in our dispositions, who we are based on how we think, feel, and behave. In fact, people sometimes refer to traits as dispositions. Traits exist on a continuum. People are thought to have more or less of a trait depending on how often, how intensely, and how consistently they demonstrate a certain behavior. For example, Angela may be described as extroverted, meaning she is generally energized by social interaction and enjoys more stimulation than those who are more introverted. Traits can be viewed from a nomothetic or ideographic perspective. Nomothetic approaches emphasize the comparisons between people and view people as generally similar to each other, which, in this case, is in terms of their traits. The idea here is that people share the same traits but to different degrees. Ideographic approaches propose that personality is exceptionally unique, and one person's trait can never be exactly like someone else's. In this view, an individual might have a trait that no one else on the planet shares, as unlikely as that may be. Trait theories are developed in order to describe and/or explain personality along with our expression of personality through behaviors. Similarly, theories lead to the development of assessment measures that help to evaluate the personality constructs of interest. Trait theories can be descriptive or causal. Descriptive theories seek to catalog and describe traits. The goal is to provide a descriptive summary of someone's personality. Causal theories, on the other hand, attempt to explain how traits influence behaviors and are more interested in factors like needs and motives. They seek to explain how various contextual and individual factors work together in affecting personality. The goal of causal theories is to predict behaviors based on known personality traits. For example, genetics and other biological factors help explain traits, but they do not account for the whole story. McCrae and Suit in 2018 cautioned that causal theories of personality are particularly challenging in light of the research limitations. You cannot randomly assign people to certain personality traits, nor can you easily manipulate them. For example, John is a jealous man is a descriptive statement about John's personality. John acts in a jealous way when he sees his partner flirting with another person at the bar is a causal statement that explains why John acts that way. That is, it acknowledges other factors that influence his response. For example, it could be related to the external context of John's environment. Alternatively, or in addition, John might be deeply insecure about his self-worth, and that might be influencing his jealousy. Ultimately, causal theories are attempts to explain or predict personality expression and behavioral choices. This speaks to situational specificity, which is explored on the next slide. As you've probably noticed in your own life, personality is not stable at all times. For example, Joanna may be a very generous person, but in times that she is financially stressed, she might be more cautious about spending on herself and others. Another example might be if Alejandro is generally easygoing and calm, but becomes angrier and more aggressive when his child is being treated poorly by a relative. That protective instinct might change how his personality is expressed in that situation. Or perhaps Cynthia is more assertive with people in her life that she feels safe with, but acts very passively around authority figures and bosses. Or maybe you hate being told what to do, and will do something that is not typical of your personality just to prove a point or assert your independence. If you agreed with that statement, you probably rank high in psychological reactivity. The idea that personality expression and behavioral choices are context-dependent was first introduced by Walter Mischel in his book Personality and Assessment in 1968. He used the term personality coefficient to bring attention to the fact that the correlation between traits and behaviors is relatively limited. This kicked off what is known as the person-situation debate. It turns out that it's not either or, it's both. That is, situations influence personality, but personality is also relatively stable over time. The idea that our traits, or our stable tendencies, are affected by our states in specific situations is often referred to as interactionism, which was first proposed by Magnuson and Elder in 1977, nearly a decade later. Interactionism accounts for consistency and variability by acknowledging that people are influenced by context but also have a general tendency that is consistent over time. For example, Jamal might be an impulsive person overall, but if he is really motivated, he may decide to eat a healthy breakfast each morning in order to have sustained energy for goals that are important to him, even if he strongly prefers Frosted Flakes. The degree of personality influence depends on the strength of the contextual factors. In weak situations, personality tends to predominate. For example, a calm person who is mildly annoyed by the slow checkout lane is likely to remain calm. In strong situations, however, personality traits are less influential, and the situation has more of a sway over behavior. For example, Alejandro is easygoing until he sees his child spanked by a family member, which triggers his protectiveness and elicits anger and aggression, things that are not typical of his behavior. The situation greatly affected him. Personality not only influences our response to situations, it also influences which situations we choose to get ourselves into. For example, I'm more introverted and easily startled, so I never sign up voluntarily for Halloween horror nights or for scary movies. To some extent, I have control over the situations that I'm involved in. But we never have full control. Hello, horror movie commercials and trailers when I'm trying to watch Schitt's Creek. Hampson and Edmonds 2017 suggests that, ultimately, personality traits can be said to be relatively stable over time, but with individual variability depending on the context. Therefore, they explain and predict our unique patterns of behavior across time and situations on average. While they help us understand each other and our own tendencies, it does not conclusively predict how someone will behave in a specific situation. It does not speak to our motivations, our needs, our prior experiences, the people that we're interacting with, and a host of other factors. With that said, Englam et al. Recently found that measures of well-being are significantly stable over time, despite the influence of situational factors. This speaks to the importance of understanding personality traits insofar as they influence well-being. There are many factors that influence how we act in any given situation. Two of them are evocation and manipulation. Evocation refers to unintentionally eliciting a response from someone else. Essentially, it's the ways in which our personality evoke responses from other people. Evocation can refer to how your personality influences your own responses to someone else, which can then influence theirs. The example on the slide illustrates that disagreeable manipulative behaviors tend to evoke hostile responses and elicit avoidance from others. Here's another example. If someone cut in line at the grocery store, I would assume that they didn't see me, or were in a really big hurry, or wouldn't really think very much about it, nor do much about it. Someone else might feel very angry and shout at the person to go to the end of the line, which might elicit aggressiveness from the person who cut in the first place. The person's response to the line cutting changes the dynamic itself. Personality not only influences the dynamic between people, but it also influences the situation itself. For example, very energetic children tend to evoke frustration from adults, which can often lead to power struggles between those children and their adult authority figures and caregivers. So, their personality trait of high activity evokes situations characterized by hostility and competition. Manipulation refers to intentional tactics used to shape a person's environment or elicit a particular response from others. There are many forms of manipulation, but they all involve the deliberate attempt to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. Manipulation can range from relatively mild, like a child exaggerating pain caused by falling in order to get their parents to kiss it and give them a lollipop. It can also be much more extreme and problematic, such as using blackmail to force someone to keep a secret about an illegal activity. Charm tactics refer to the strategy of being overly kind, complimentary, and generous in order to elicit the same from someone else. The logical fallacy that underlies this approach is known as appeals to pride, which involves using praise and flattery to get someone to respond in a particular way. I see this all the time in emails that start off with, "Dear Dr. Lewis, you may be just the solution we've been looking for." As much as it's nice to think that I'm so special, the reality is that they are sending that email to hundreds, if not thousands of others. The goal is to make me feel special so that I'll be more likely to go along with their request, which almost always involves spending money. The silent treatment involves exactly what it sounds like: ignoring, failing to respond, and/or refusing to acknowledge someone's presence. Coercion consists of utilizing forceful demands, criticism, and threats as a means of achieving self-interest, and of the three is considered to be the worst and the most impactful. There are two main approaches to personality theories and assessments: theoretical and empirical. Let's start by looking at theoretical approaches. Theoretical approaches begin with proposing a theory before developing dimensions and/or items that correspond to that theory. It focuses on the theory itself and not statistical data. The goal is to determine the dimensions that are important as informed by the theory itself. Gordon Allport and Jerry Wiggins both developed theoretical explanations of personality traits, much of which has since been validated to some extent with empirical research. The difference is that these approaches were developed based on theories rather than being built on statistical data. We'll look at those before we move on to the empirical approaches, which utilize more experimental designs and statistical analyses to develop, test, and validate the theories and the corresponding assessment measures. As you learned in the first lecture video, Gordon Allport is considered to be one of the founders of personality psychology. He is also widely considered to be one of the founders of trait theory. Interestingly, Allport, along with his colleague Henry Odbert, began developing trait theory by perusing Webster's New International Dictionary published in 1952. Together, they made note of every term that they thought described a potential personality trait. This approach was built upon the earlier work of Sir Francis Galton, who was the first to articulate the lexical hypothesis in 1884. Essentially, the lexical hypothesis refers to the fact that aspects of human life, such as personality traits, become an important part of our language. They identified nearly 18,000 words that describe personality or personal behavior, which they stated accounted for approximately 5% of the English language. From there, they listed around 4,500 descriptions in their 1936 article, Trait Names, a Psycholexical Study in Psychological Monographs. Allport went on to publish his book, Personality, A Psychological Interpretation, in 1937, which laid out the personality theories that he is most known for today. He started with a list of thousands of traits that he slowly boiled down and organized into 3 trait categories: cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. Note that these are also referred to as dispositions, that is, cardinal dispositions, central dispositions, and secondary dispositions. Also, while they are nicely encapsulated into 3 categories, Allport was open about the somewhat arbitrary division between each category. He argued that these categories are hierarchical and that each human has hundreds of traits on at least some of these levels. Cardinal traits are those that dominate our entire personality and powerfully shape our behavior. It is considered to be the personality trait that strongly characterizes a person and is largely consistent over time and context. Notably, Allport suggested that most people do not have a cardinal trait, but if they do, it is particularly hard to hide from others. For example, greed might be the central trait of Ebenezer Scrooge, and that greed largely defines his personality and everybody sees it. Most people are multifaceted and are best described as a combination of multiple traits. Therefore, central traits make up the majority of our personalities. These are the terms that come to mind when asked to describe your personality or the personality of someone else you know. For example, outgoing, thoughtful, generous, patient, honest, grouchy, and loyal are all likely to be central traits. Lastly, secondary traits are the least obvious, least consistent, and least influential. Secondary traits are considered to be the most context-dependent and the most likely to be kept private from others. These include preferences, attitudes, etc. They help to explain instances in which a person's behavior may seem incongruent with their typical personality. For example, someone who is typically sensation-seeking and who loves a challenge and being the center of attention may feel anxious during their first live TV broadcast. Allport also noted that internal and external conditions influence people's behaviors and included aspects such as motivation and determination in terms of their influence on personality expression. He clearly differentiates motivations or motives from drives, which he viewed as more unconscious in nature. Unlike the majority of theorists at his time, Allport was particularly interested in the conscious aspects of behavior. He argued against the popular theories of the time, such as Freudian psychoanalytic theory, and believed that people are motivated by much more than the unconscious processes and events of the past. You'll learn more about Freudian psychoanalytic theory in Unit 2 of this course. Jerry Wiggins developed his CIRCUMPLEX model in the late 70s and early 80s. As the name suggests, Wiggins was most interested in the structure and intersection of interpersonally oriented traits. Note that this is also referred to as the interpersonal circle. Wiggins went on also to develop the interpersonal adjective scales with colleagues Trapnell and Phillips. The interpersonal circumplex consists of two axes: the vertical axis of dominance, also known as power, control, status, or agency, and the horizontal axis of warmth or friendliness, love, affiliation, or communion. The interpersonal circumplex is essentially a theoretical model of personality that explores the intersection of dominance and warmth. As you can see in the image, these two dimensions create four quadrants, with varying terms used to describe a person who falls in that space. For example, someone who is high in warmth and dominance tends to be outgoing, gregarious, and extroverted, while someone low in warmth and dominance is more likely to come across as detached, aloof, and introverted. People can also be described in one dimension, with someone high in dominance being self-assured, while someone low in dominance being more submissive. Likewise, someone high in warmth is more likely to be agreeable compared to the cold-hearted person who is at the other end of the warmth spectrum. Wiggins' model set the theoretical foundation for the empirical work that we'll be discussing next. Research, such as McCrae and Costa in 1989, suggests correspondence between the interpersonal traits presented in the circle and the big five factors of extraversion and agreeableness that are discussed later in this lecture. Being gregarious, friendly, and dominant are all akin to extraversion, while more reserved, aloof, and submissive traits are more akin to introversion. Moreover, friendly, unassuming, and submissive individuals tend to be more agreeable than those who are more arrogant and calculating. Overall, dominance relates most strongly to extraversion and openness, while warmth correlates with agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. In fact, Wiggins later hopped onto the five-factor model train, otherwise known as Big Five Traits, and even served as an editor on a 1996 book called The Five-Factor Model of Personality: Theoretical Perspectives, which includes a chapter by him and his colleague Paul Trapnell entitled A Dyadic Interactional Perspective of the Five-Factor Model. Unlike theoretical approaches, empirical approaches define personality based on experimental data. Empirical approaches, therefore, rely much more heavily on empirically validated measures and careful observations. Empirical approaches were a response against the predominant approach at the time, which involved projective tests like the Rorschach and the thematic apperception test. Notably, while empirical research approaches were becoming more popular, researchers like Henry Murray were hard at work trying to prove that the thematic apperception test would be a good measure of understanding human personality, so the two approaches certainly coexist. Factor analysis is a statistical approach that is one of the most common ways of approaching personality from an empirical perspective. In essence, factor analysis is a statistical approach that assesses common properties in order to determine what are referred to as factors. That is, it attempts to distill a large number of items into smaller, more useful sets based on covariance. This refers to which items go together. Factor analysis ultimately helps us categorize similar traits into a general index. For example, as you can see in the image, agreeableness consists of facets such as cooperation, altruism, and morality, amongst others. The strength of the correlation between items are referred to as factor loadings. The higher the number, the stronger the correlation. Louis Thurstone was the first to use factor analysis to study personality in the 1930s when he reduced 60 traits to 5 factors. This was only a couple of years before Allport and Odbert published their list of over 4,000 terms. A decade later, Raymond Cattell further condensed these terms down to 16 dimensions of personality based on factor analysis data. Cattell is arguably the most famous theorist in terms of using factor analysis to study personality. But while he's famous for it, note that factor analysis is a statistical approach that was first introduced by Pearson in 1901 and then built upon by Spearman in 1904, decades before Cattell picked it up for personality research purposes. Cattell took Allport's long list of traits and narrowed them down using factor analysis to about 170 traits, which he then categorized into 16 dimensions referred to as factors. These 16 factors, as well as his personality assessment based on these factors, known as the 16PF, are presented on the next slide. Donald Fisk was one of the first researchers to analyze Cattell's data and ultimately identified 5 common factors: confident self-expression, social adaptability, conformity, emotional control, and inquiring intellect. Then, in the early 1960s, Ernest Toops and Raymond Kristall used Cattell's scales in the study with Air Force trainees. Their research also suggested 5 factors that were then replicated by Warren Norman in 1963, leading to the term, the quote, Norman 5. Interestingly, Norman began as a true skeptic and critic of the Big Five structure and of Cattell's work, but ultimately ended up supporting it. Edgar Borgata was interested in Toops and Kristall's findings and worked on creating a structure based on self-ratings and peer ratings. He also ended up with 5 factors, but he termed them assertiveness, likability, responsibility, emotionality, and intelligence. Meanwhile, in 1967, Gene Smith shared his 5 essential traits. His 5 dimensions were close to those used now, namely extraversion, agreeableness, strength of character, emotionality, and refinement. Smith also noted correlations among the factors, including between behaviors like smoking cigarettes, being negatively correlated with agreeableness and strength of character, and positively correlated with extraversion. Similarly, John Digman began his trait theory research as a skeptic of the Big Five and was convinced that there would need to be more factors. In his attempts to prove that 10 factors would be more representative, he ended up confirming that these 5 factors were the most robust. Meanwhile, Louis Goldberg strongly believed in the 5 primary traits and popularized the term the Big Five around 1990 when he published an alternate description of personality, the Big Five factor structure. He had previously used that term in the 80s, but it didn't seem to catch on until that 1990 publication. Paul Costa and Robert McCrae, whom I've read goes by Jeff rather than Robert, demonstrated that Wiggins' interpersonal adjectives scale correspond to extraversion and agreeableness and could be accurately measured with the NEO personality inventory which they developed. While they used slightly different terminology for their 5 factors, their research confirmed both the 5-factor model and the Big Five, thereby confirming Goldberg's work in the process. In 1991, Costa and McCrae published the full instrument with facet scores for all 5 factors. Note that many publications are McCrae and Costa, so it can go in the opposite order, and there have been many other colleagues as well, such as Oliver John. McCrae and Costa stated as recently as 2003 that they believed the theory should be referred to as the 5-factor theory rather than simply a model. Note that Digman, Goldberg, McCrae, and Costa have all published dozens, if not hundreds of times, starting as early as the 1960s, and especially in the mid to late 80s until now. Hans and Sybil Eysenck are also well-known empirical personality theorists who utilize factor analysis in their research. We will discuss their contributions in the biological perspectives of personality section, since they posited that biological factors were the largest determinant of personality traits. You will be introduced to iSync this week and will learn more about Allport, Cattell, and the Big Five in this week's video, Trait Theory of Personality. Next, you'll learn how to calculate factor analysis. Just kidding, I'll leave that for your statistics courses. Raymond Cattell studied chemistry before transitioning to psychology, which helps to explain his emphasis on empirical investigation. It's also no surprise that he set out to develop a periodic table of personality. Cattell developed factor analysis as an approach to studying personality. Again, factor analysis involves identifying clusters of items and distilling them into smaller, more useful sets. The resulting dimensions are referred to as factors. You can check out Cattell's 16 personality factors on the chart on this slide. I do want to note that the terms may be expressed slightly differently across sources, especially because Cattell expressed these on continuums rather than with trait names themselves. Cattell is most famous for these 16 personality factors and the corresponding 16 personality factors test, which was first published in 1949, about a decade after Allport and Odeberg. The 16 personality factors questionnaire has been updated multiple times, with the fifth most recent edition published in 1993. Cattell based his findings on a variety of data sources, including self-report observation, life records, and experimental situations. L data, as he called it, referred to life record data, such as peer reports, school grades, military conduct reports, and marital history. Q data, which was collected by self-report on questionnaires, was contrasted against T data, which referred to more objective measurements, such as those that could be carefully controlled and empirically proven. He differentiated also between surface traits and source traits. Surface traits are those clusters of personality traits that correlate with each other, while source traits are the underlying structure of personality. He considered source traits as much more important and influential compared to surface traits. The source traits became the foundation of the 16 personality factors displayed on this slide. While Cattell undoubtedly contributed to our understanding of personality traits, his research has not been well replicated. With that said, it did spur the investigation into other trait theories, including the five-factor model. In fact, you can take each of these 16 factors and categorize them under the Big Five traits that we'll discuss next. As I mentioned earlier, the five-factor model was developed by a variety of researchers, most recently and notably including Digman, Goldberg, Costa, and McCrae. It was Goldberg who is credited for popularizing the term Big Five in his 1990 publication, which by big he meant broad, not necessarily uber important. It was then Costa and McCrae who validated the model with their research and first introduced the terms used to create the OCEAN acronym that you see on this slide. In the Big Five model, openness to experience is often referred to as intellect, and prior to that, culture. Neuroticism was referred to as emotional stability, and extraversion as surgency. While it is less common, if you want to play a little boggle, the letters that make up the word ocean also make up the word canoe, and thus you may see that acronym out in the world too. Technically, the five-factor model uses these terms and is sometimes referred to by its acronym OCEAN. Goldberg, who championed the term Big Five, used slightly different terms as I mentioned previously. Although the five-factor model put forth by Costa and McCrae is based on questionnaire data, the Big Five stayed grounded in its lexical hypothesis foundation. While there are other differences between the five-factor model and the Big Five model, we are going to use the OCEAN model moving forward. I will use the term Big Five in its colloquial sense to refer to the five factors. That is because the term Big Five is often used to refer to the five factors in the five-factor model. When the term model is used, the Big Five model speaks specifically to those five factors. However, when it's just the Big Five, it's used overall to refer to these five traits, regardless of the exact terminology used. We'll discuss each of these traits in more detail in the following slides. You'll also find out where you score in the spectrum for each of these traits, as well as for the more specific description for each trait, referred to as facets, when you take the IPIP-NEO, which you've hopefully already done. You will notice that it's not all or nothing. You are not extroverted or introverted. You are somewhere on the continuum between these poles. As you continue to read Gosling's Snoop, you will hopefully begin to see evidence of these traits in your environment too. Before I move on to the specific traits, I want to first say that there is no universal good or bad trait. While you might prefer to see yourself as high, low, or medium on any of these traits, they all have their pros and cons, and there's always room for improvement if your natural tendency doesn't align with your valued goals. For example, someone who is not naturally conscientious can nonetheless develop organizational skills to help support them in this area. Interestingly, while these traits were initially developed and measured from a Western perspective, subsequent research has determined significant cross-cultural validity as well, so we should all be able to relate to our results to some extent. Moreover, although the Big Five are considered to be relatively stable throughout life, there is some variability to that story. You'll learn more about the Big Five traits from a lifespan perspective in this week's peer-reviewed article, Life Events and Personality Trait Change by Bleedorn et al. 2018. You'll also learn more about the heritability or the genetic component of passing down traits when we discuss biological influences later in the course. Let's begin with the O of ocean, openness to experience. This refers to a person's willingness and desire to try new things. It is most closely related to the life domain of intellect, though it doesn't directly correlate with IQ scores. Instead, intellect shows up as intellectual curiosity, symbolic thinking, and the variety of interests one might hold. On that note, intellect is the Big Five model term used to describe this trait. Similarly, Fiske termed this trait inquiring intellect. A person who scores high on openness to experience is likely to be creative, to enjoy considering abstract topics, and to feel motivated to take on new challenges in life. They are outside-of-the-box thinkers who prefer variety, novelty, and independence. They are more likely to be described by others as eccentric, worldly, or curious. Someone low in this trait is more likely to be resistant to new ideas and to change. They tend to dislike more abstract and theoretical concepts. They prefer concrete thinking and concrete forms of entertainment. They are also not particularly drawn to creative or imaginative pursuits. They appreciate routines and familiar aspects of life. They are more likely to be described by others as practical, conservative, and down-to-earth. Unlike those who are high in openness, who enjoy traveling and trying new things, those low in openness do not tend to like change and are more likely to enjoy eating at a restaurant they've been to millions of times before and know what they like there. While those who are high in openness are generally inventive and curious, those low in this trait are more likely to be viewed as cautious and pragmatic. Of course, you could also score more towards the middle and be average in openness to experience. The people who fall between these descriptions are willing to try new things to a degree, but also appreciate tradition and routine. Some facets of openness to experience that you will see or hopefully have seen on the IPIP-NEO are imagination, artistic interests, adventurousness, and liberalism. Conscientiousness refers to the degree to which we engage in self-control related to long-term goals and values. That is, the tendency to be organized, dependable, disciplined, and planful. Fiske referred to it as conformity. It particularly relates to our life domain of work, but also very much applies to being a student, which falls under the work umbrella. Research, such as Soto and John 2012, suggests that we become more conscientious as we age. So, if you scored low in this area, you might find that it increases over time. While impulsivity has a bad connotation, it is important to note that impulsive people enjoy the spark of spontaneity and have a lot of fun in life. Assuming that impulsivity is not destructive, self-sabotaging, or antisocial in nature, it is associated with a colorful and present-focused life. High scores on conscientiousness, on the other hand, tend to be consistent with being very self-controlled. These people tend to put aside impulses in favor of accomplishing goals and doing the best job possible. These are people who are very attentive to details, love to-do lists, and other external aids like alarms and calendars. They prefer structure. Moreover, they are very organized, disciplined, efficient, and persistent planners who are often quite successful. But, as John Johnson notes on his IPIP-NEO descriptions website, it's not all good news. High scorers also tend to be workaholics and perfectionists who may come across as stuffy or boring. They can be obsessive and stubborn. In contrast, low scorers, in addition to being spontaneous, can be criticized for the opposite. According to Johnson, these individuals are sometimes viewed as lacking ambition and not properly following the rules. While they are never viewed as stuffy, They are at risk of losing track of life goals in favor of present moment enjoyment. With that said, they are much more flexible than their highly conscientious counterparts. Average scorers have struck a balance between these poles. They are, as Johnson puts it, reasonably reliable, organized, and self-controlled. Some facets of conscientiousness on the IPIP-NEO are cautiousness, orderliness, achievement striving, and self-discipline. Extraversion, which is referred to as surgency in the Big Five model and confident self-expression in Fisk's model, is commonly misunderstood. The life domain of extraversion is sociability, but don't read into that term too much, because while many people assume that extroverted people are those who perform well in social situations, this actually relates more to social skills than to personality. Instead, extraversion refers to the degree of desire to engage with the external world and the tendency to seek out and enjoy sensory stimulation. Many people use a battery analogy to describe the extroversion-introversion continuum. Extroverts charge their batteries by socializing and engaging in stimulating activities, whereas introverts drain their batteries doing the same. Again, it's not that introverts necessarily dislike socializing. It's just that they might need more alone time or more quiet time to recharge from it. They also tend to prefer smaller groups of people. People often mistake me for an extrovert because I enjoy people and I have decent social skills, or I like to think so. But I actually score pretty darn low in extroversion and find socializing more tiring than a lot of people expect, and I prefer to spend my time in relatively quiet, serene spaces. You'll learn more about introversion in the assigned NPR article by Susan Cain, and we'll also learn more about the biological aspects of extroversion versus introversion when we get to iSync in the biological materials. To sum it up, people who score high in extroversion tend to be energetically engaged with their environment. Again, it charges their batteries. These are the people who love to talk about anything and everything, including small talk, and thrive in social situations. They are outgoing, enthusiastic, friendly, assertive, and generally comfortable being the center of attention. Extreme extroverts may even come across as attention-seeking or domineering. In contrast, those who score low in extroversion, who can be referred to as more introverted, are much less energetic and active. They tend to prefer more solitary activities and need much less stimulation than their extroverted counterparts. In fact, they are much more likely to be overwhelmed by the amount of sensory stimulation extroverts regularly crave and surround themselves with. Introverts may still very much appreciate social interactions and relationships, but they tend to prefer smaller groups and deeper conversations than extroverts. In social settings, they may also prefer to observe others rather than be in the spotlight. Johnson notes that this is sometimes mistaken as unfriendliness or arrogance, but that is more related to agreeableness than introversion. Introverted people who score high in agreeableness are simply less outgoing and prefer being alone, but that doesn't mean that they are rude, shy, or depressed. With that said, they are sometimes interpreted as aloof, disengaged, or self-involved. Of course, you can be average as well, which would mean that you may prefer less stimulation and socializing than true extroverts, but more so than a true introvert. Some facets of extroversion are friendliness, gregariousness, assertiveness, and excitement-seeking. Agreeableness refers to an individual's degree of concern regarding social harmony and the degree to which they tend to compromise, collaborate, and cooperate as an attempt to maintain said harmony. Fisk referred to it as social adaptability. Soto and John 2012 found that, like conscientiousness, we also tend to become more agreeable as we age. The life domain is love. High scores on agreeableness suggest that the person is concerned with other people's well-being. These individuals tend to be easy to get along with and want everyone to get along. Therefore, they tend to be well-liked as they are considerate, helpful, and willing to compromise as needed. Johnson notes that these people tend to be more optimistic about human nature and approach others through the lens of trust. In contrast, low scorers are consistent with having less concern for others and a less trusting lens from which they view others. These people also tend to be less cooperative and friendly, and therefore usually less popular. While people may view those who are more disagreeable as cold and critical, their resistance to the pull of popularity can be an asset, particularly for careers that depend on assertiveness and objectivity. While high scorers may be viewed as naive and submissive, low scorers are more likely to come across as suspicious, argumentative, and antagonistic. An average score on agreeableness reflects a middle ground approach to others, in which others' needs are considered, but not necessarily to the extent that an individual would sacrifice their own needs or desires. Some facets of agreeableness are trust, modesty, morality, and sympathy. The last of the 5 factors is neuroticism, which reflects how prone an individual is to psychological stress. In the Big 5 model, it is referred to as emotional stability, as Goldberg tends to prefer using the, quote, positive pole. Fisk termed the trait emotional control. The life domain is affect, which refers to emotionality. High scores are characterized by moodiness, nervousness, and high anxiety. More neurotic individuals tend to be more emotionally reactive, easily upset, sensitive, and pessimistic. That is, they experience more dramatic shifts in mood and have a harder time bouncing back from stressful events. They may be viewed as passionate, dynamic, sensitive, and engaging, but may also come across as unstable, overly emotional, and insecure. In contrast, low scores reflect personalities that are more relaxed, calm, and emotionally stable. They tend to handle stress well and are confident about their ability to handle stress, and they remain calm most of the time. While they do not worry as often and have an easier time responding to and/or recovering from difficult emotional experiences such as anger, vulnerability, anxiety, and sadness, they are sometimes perceived as more apathetic and uninspired compared to those who score higher in this trait. An average score of neuroticism reflects balanced reactivity to stress. These individuals are calm in the face of relatively minor stressors, but will react to notable stressors more often than those who are low in neuroticism. With that said, they recover more easily and more quickly than those who score higher. Johnson notes that while low neuroticism is associated with less reactivity to stress, it does not mean they necessarily experience a lot of joy or other so-called positive emotions. That is reflected more in extraversion. Some facets of neuroticism include depression, anger, self-consciousness, and vulnerability. Before we finish up this lecture, I want to touch upon the assessments that you'll be taking this week and next. So this week, you should have already taken the IPIP-NEO test. Next week, you'll be taking the DISC and the HEXACO personality tests, along with the optional Dark Triad. Those 3 tests will be discussed on the next slide. The International Personality Item Pool, IPIP, includes 3,320 items developed by Louis Goldberg at the Oregon Research Institute and is a public domain option in which it is fully open source. From that comes the International Personality Item Pool representation of the NEO-PIR. This includes scoring narrative reports that were developed by John Johnson at Pennsylvania State University. It assesses personality according to the Big 5 traits along with 30 facets, or sub-traits, 6 facets for each of the Big 5 traits. The website includes an option with 300 items, which is the original, the one you are directed to take, and one with 230 items, which is shortened, less reliable, and not recommended due to its limited reliability compared to the original. I do want to note that the IPIP-NEO is not equivalent to the commercial tests like the NEO-PIR and the NEO-FFI. These options are generally considered to be the best inventories for measuring the Big 5 or the 5-factor model, but its commercial status and copyright laws limit its use for this course due to the costs involved. I also want to point out that there are many other assessment measures for the Big 5, including the Big 5 Inventory, which is a short self-report assessment with only 44 items that you can find on Oliver John's website. It is freely used without permission for non-commercial use. There is also the Big 5 Aspect Scale by Colin DeYoung and colleagues, which is also public domain, and the Big 5 Mini Markers by Gerard Saussure, which is a list of 40 adjectives based on Goldberg's initial set of 100. The shortest approach to the Big 5 measurement is the 10-item personality inventory by Sam Gosling, author of Snoop, along with Jason Renfro and Bill Swan. Any of these tests can be located with a quick Google search if you want to try it out and compare your results across tests. Note that you are assigned to take the full IPIP-NEO, so this would be in addition to that assessment. With that said, all of these are available for free, so if you're interested, they're a quick Google search away. The final thing that we'll talk about in this lecture are the HEXACO, DISC, and Dark Triad assessments. In addition to taking the HEXACO, DISC, and potentially the Dark Triad, you will also read the peer-reviewed article Predicting Psychological and Subjective Well-Being from Personality, a meta-analysis by Engelm et al. 2020 that looks at personality and psychological well-being from the perspective of the Big Five and HEXACO. You'll also learn more details about all three of these assessment measures in the 2 overview videos included in next week's module. Additionally, there are a couple of optional peer-reviewed articles that you might find interesting. I do recommend that you take the assessments prior to viewing the videos and reading the articles, and that's why I'll only briefly cover them here. HEXACO is very similar to the Big Five model, but with an added 6th trait, which is honesty-humility. It was first introduced by Kibum Lee and Michael Ashton in 2004 and has since been revised multiple times. Emotionality is similar to neuroticism, and the others use the same terminology. The HEXACO is unique in that it lists 4 subtraits for each of the 6 factors. For example, honesty-humility has sincerity, fairness, greed avoidance, and modesty, while emotionality subtraits are fearfulness, anxiety, dependence, and sentimentality. You will see the others when you view your score report. You will notice at the bottom of the score report there's a standalone scale called altruism, which is on the newest HEXACO revision. It was added in 2006 and reflects the tendency to be sympathetic and generous to those in need. Unlike the main 6 domains, it is considered an interstitial facet scale, which refers to the fact that it measures aspects of honesty, humility, agreeableness, and emotionality. In the 1940s and 50s, Walter Clark picked up on the groundwork laid by William Moulton Marston in the 1920s and developed the DISC. Clark, an industrial psychologist, studied under Marston at Columbia University. While DISC originally stood for drive, influence, submission, and caution, it has been revised and now stands for either dominance or drive, influence, steadiness, and compliance. Dominance refers to how someone deals with problems in their lives. High is consistent with being assertive and maybe even aggressive, while low is consistent with people who are generally cooperative and peaceful. Influence pertains to how someone interacts with others. Those high in influence tend to be friendly, outgoing, and optimistic about people, whereas those who are lower in influence are more likely to be factual, pessimistic, and potentially more suspicious of other people's motives. Steadiness relates to our pacing and consistency. High scorers are described as behaving in a more passive, stable, and patient manner compared to low scorers who tend to behave in more demonstrative, impulsive, and erratic ways. Lastly, compliance refers to how someone deals with procedures. High scorers are more methodical and analytical compared to low scorers who are more arbitrary and stubborn. One very important thing to note about the DISC is that it is very sensitive to behavioral change over time and therefore has low test-retest reliability. It gives a nice snapshot of where someone is at the time that they take it in terms of their behaviors, but it doesn't do a good job of predicting future behaviors, and it doesn't necessarily tell us about the person's underlying personality. This is because the DISC heavily focuses on how people act, not why. So someone who is actually quite disagreeable may nonetheless score low in dominance because they act cooperatively. Keep in mind that our motivations can be quite powerful, so if your goal is to be well liked at work to help set you up for a promotion, it makes sense that you'd act like an agreeable person, despite a strong urge to tell people off. So always keep in mind that the person's score is a reflection of how they act, not necessarily how they want to. Lastly, the Dark Triad was first introduced by Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams, and it refers to Machiavellianism, narcissism, and subclinical psychopathy. You'll learn more detail in the assigned videos, but to sum it up, Machiavellianism involves inauthenticity and manipulativeness for personal gain. Narcissism reflects entitlement and inflated self-esteem, and psychopathy, which is the worst of the 3, involves a total lack of empathy to the extent that they would willingly hurt a person or animal physically or emotionally or both without remorse, regret, or pain in doing so. While each of these terms have a negative connotation, they're not necessarily bad, especially Machiavellianism and narcissism in lower levels, which may exist as a self-preservation strategy, both in terms of resources and self-esteem. Overall, the Dark Triad accounts for ethically, morally, and socially questionable behaviors. Note that while the Dark Triad is not based on the Big Five model, the constructs do correlate somewhat with 3 of the 5 Big Five traits. All of the traits correlate with agreeableness, psychopathy with low neuroticism, and Machiavellianism and psychopathy with low conscientiousness. Later in the course, we will explore types, which was the predominant approach to personality assessment prior to trait theory. While we are going in the opposite chronological order, trait theory is considered more valid and reliable, which makes for a great place to start learning about personality.